a good friend of mine always says when we're talking about this is like, look, would you want to be in that position as a government, especially early on when there's this new virus coming out of China? There's like videos doing the rounds on the internet of people just collapsing in the street, which I would fucking love to know who put those out, because we saw that nowhere else. So that I want to know who that was. But anyway, but the like, it's there's been no movement, basically, in my understanding, from that initial response. It's like we said, here's what we know about COVID. We planned out like the response to it against, as you've mentioned, like previous public health like knowledge, basically. Like I know we did. My mum always says about the masks, is like, we don't even wear them in theater because they last for 15 minutes, their effectiveness. And I'm like, hang on, so you're like, because she told me that, and I was like, hang on, they tell you that they only last 15 minutes? And I was like, what are we doing here? But like, I can almost understand the early response. It's like, there's something big and new and unknown, like freak out, panic, fair enough, right? I'm not proud that that's how our leaders responded, or the public, but like, that's completely understandable in my mind. What confuses me is like, so our understanding of how COVID spreads, who are the most vulnerable people, things like that, all evolved quite rapidly. Like we went from thinking that there was people saying that masks work, and then they said, well, you know, the virus is tiny, they're not really working, and the most important thing is ventilation in a room, because the masks aren't preventing the spread, because I think we now have it's 85% aerosolized in the transmission. So like our understanding has developed, but our response to it hasn't changed. Like, why do you think that is?
These are deep questions, right? I first of all, I completely agree with you, right? That, as it were, the government and the scientific advisors around the government lost their intelligence. They lost their ability to openly discuss what new medicines there might be, alternative treatments, what the optimal way would be to sort of prevent spread at a certain rate, or how to, as it were, try to help particular groups avoid things. And for instance, whether it would be a smart thing to have people who've recovered from the virus around the most vulnerable, because they're probably the least susceptible to another infection, and hence exactly the people you want to put around the most vulnerable, which was an early idea, which was not openly discussed, right? And so definitely the government and their science advisors sort of became very stupid, right? And that was partly because of this huge pressure to seem to be doing something, also led to a huge pressure to seem to know what they're doing. And so they couldn't exude, as it were, doubt. They couldn't have open conversations, you know, in which they would say, well, you know, yeah, we've got this flatten the curve stuff, but in fact, this was against 50 years of advice. It probably won't work. Yes, there's huge cost, but we don't know about the huge cost either. And in fact, we might have to change radically within a week. That would just be seen as unmanly and sort of, you know, unacceptable. The public wanted them to exude certainty. And so they were sort of forced to lie at the start, and then it became a matter of reasons of state to keep the lie going and to keep the pretense of certainty going, right? And so it's a little bit like the original sin. Once you're down the path of having urge, you need to cover up, because otherwise you're done for, right? And you're digging a bigger and bigger hole for yourself when it comes to the truth. But because, of course, you get all these lucrative opportunities, you can boss everybody around, you can self-enrich. There's this huge coalition emerged between the government, the medical people around them, but also enormous industry, right? Big tech made a lot of money out of this, and sort of the big internet companies and internet mediated companies made money out of this and pushed out all the small ones. Then you suddenly have no reason to sort of stop lying, as it were, right? And stop pretending that you know what you're doing. I mean, if it's making you money and power, what's not to like? Right? That is then the reality of politics. Now, do I understand how the politicians reacted? Of course, you know, it's very human, but lots of things are very human, which are still very criminal, right? and so simply because, you know, I understand a criminal doesn't mean that we should forgive them as society. This is why we have laws. This is why we have this notion of legal accountability for your actions, even if there's huge public pressure. So if a politician shoots someone else for reasons that are perfectly understandable, they still shot someone, and you should still put them up for trial. So saying that they're human that's neither here nor there. They have a responsibility, a moral responsibility. And there's not for nothing that we've had trials in the past about politicians who've done things that were understandable, but that cost enormous amount of lives and hardships. So I don't care whether I can understand them or not. The point is we need to hold them to account. And Laura Dodds, in that sense, if I may say, a piece of critique, does not want to make that leap, right? She documents how, in a way, a huge criminality occurred, but the bank stops with the top. And she's not prepared to call them out and then to say, well, what should happen in the case that the government has done a criminal conspiracy in a sense, right? And that I find that also a lack of courage to a certain extent, that if you indeed believe that what has happened is politicians losing their heads, but doing incredibly damaging things against the science of that moment, and also against, the Nuremberg trial laws, ethical principles of the last decades, you must then take the next step. What do you expect society should do with people who've done this kind of damage knowingly? That there must be, as it were, justice.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen a lot of calls for justice as such, but what's that look like in terms of holding them accountable? I had, we got in touch because of Sanjeev Sablok, and he made his case to the International Criminal Court to no avail. And I think that what you've kind of brought up there about how governments are dealing in absolutes in order to seem, correct, basically, is that it's like the sunk cost fallacy. They've come too far saying all these things work, and therefore they can't go back on it. Do you see the population at large saying, we need to hold you accountable? Because that would force people to say, maybe they didn't do the right thing, and lockdowns are not a good idea. And people have spent months screaming at people who didn't believe that was a good idea. Even if they adhered to the rules and just said, hey, I'm not a fan of this. I don't like the restriction on our rights to go where we want and to see who we want. Right to assembly, freedom of movement, all those really basic human rights. It's if you were against that, you were screamed at by a lot of people. Especially if you did it in a, should we say, indelicate way, as some people tend to do, which is fine. I understand. You can get very riled up about it. I would understand why. But do you think that that's realistic? And what form would that even take? That sort of holding politicians accountable for the decisions they've made, aside from voting them out?
Well, we talk about this issue at length in the book, right? And we sketch several scenarios. But to sort of, and I'm a great admirer of Sanjeev Sablok, who sort of resigned his position high up in the Treasury of Victoria in Australia because he saw the tremendous damage being done by policies. And he felt that was immoral and he needed to speak out. And in order to be able to speak out, he couldn't be within the civil service. And he's one of the voices in the book. So he's also one of the Jacintas who gives his story as to what he experienced. But let's put it like this. In history, politicians have usually gotten away with their crimes, right? That is the unfortunate reality, is that the top, all kinds of criminal activities are gotten away with. And to give a UK example, Tony Blair has now clearly been sort of, found guilty, if you like, of starting a war for which there were no good reasons. Hundreds of thousands of people lost their lives. Hundreds of thousands of people. And where is he? I think in a sort of a multi-million-dollar mansion, going all over the world.
Year, yeah.
Now, what would justice be if somebody who caused the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people Well, if you kill one person in Britain knowingly, well, was that 20 years in jail or something, right? So we know what justice should look like, but we're just not used to doing this with our top politicians. And that's because of the nature of our political system, is that we sort of allow our politicians to make huge mistakes, even if they're not really honest mistakes either, right? We don't really want them to be accountable. And so the historical circumstances in which politicians are truly held to account is when there's a large part of the population has gotten very angry at them. Right? So this is, happened, for instance, with Robespierre in the French Revolution. He couldn't deliver, and the population was so riled up that they decided that his head should be off as well. Or when sort of an enemy takes them over, right? So it's when there's an internal revolution, right? So, revolutions in which kings lose their heads for their misdeeds in the past, or an outsider takes them over. So, when the Allied deposed Hitler and his mob, put them all up for trial, and then said, well, you did wrong. Well, the Germans were not going to do that. Somebody had to do it for them, right? And similarly, of course, with Japan. So those are the historical circumstances, if, as it were, the politicians lose a political fight, if you like, right? Otherwise, the reality is more that if a population slowly changes its mind, which is more normal, such as with the American prohibition, sort of went, well, that was stupid, this has cost us a lot.
Yeah.
Or in China, the Cultural Revolution was generally recognized by their elites as a huge mistake. What happens then is there's a bit of a cover-up. So, the politicians who are to blame are sort of not really put on for trial. In China, they put 4 of them on trial, and that was it. Kind of like, a little bit of a symbolism.
Yeah. Was that more of a power grab, though, by...
The Gang of 4.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So that's, but of course there were hundreds of people involved in that, right? Thousands. So you could put a lot more, but that didn't really happen. But then there is, as it were, an internal reckoning a little bit inside politics. So things like truth commissions are then one way to go, right? Which is sort of, we can't all put you into jail or sort of, worse, as it were, to these people. But you can try and reclaim some of the money that has been siphoned off. You can expose tax the gains of, the corrupt activities that have taken place. But you can also have an open, truthful conversation about, okay, well, that was stupid. Why did we do this? And that tends to happen over time. So, royal commissions are a means in Australia. You can have an inquiry, which is the usual UK way of trying to do this, although often inquiries are sort of, sabotaged. But there are, as it were, ways and means of democracy for changing its mind and then having some limited degree of accountability. And I'm sure that we'll go through that the next decades, right? We'll have lots of inquiries, and I'd be surprised if the first ones are not entirely rigged and sort of, the politicians will come out smelling like roses. But there will be later ones, right? This is a long trajectory. We are looking at a decade of inquiries ahead. And I think the later ones will be more realistic than the first ones.
I mean, I'm kind of concerned that, because I do want an inquiry, right? But I would also like it to look at this as in the way that you've laid it out. It's like, look, we've done something that was of great cost. Like, should we have done this? Was this worth it? And I don't think that's how the inquiry is going to go whatsoever. In the UK, I would say, at least. In the UK, what I envision happening is going to be the inquiry will be about, why didn't we lock down faster? How many lives could have been saved if we'd just gone like full, like no one leave their house? That Boris Johnson was too soft on COVID or whatever. Like that's the way I see it going. Like, do you think there's a realistic chance of there being any inquiry ever that like actually says, hey, this wasn't worth what we did? Because that would require a lot of people to say we got it wrong. People are really bad at that.
Look, I totally agree with you about the first inquiry. The first inquiry will be a whitewash, and it'll be all this bollocks about, were we harsh enough, right? Did we listen to the scientists enough? Whereas, in fact, the scientists follow them rather than the other way around. But history is funny in this way, right? And the Iraq War is a great one as well, right? Originally,
there was a lot more public opposition to that.
There was a lot more, but there was also a change of mind gradually of the population, So for the first 7 years, Blair was still in power and he got voted in and there was no serious inquiry whatsoever. But, 15 years after the war, when it's sort of a little bit more distant memory, then, the knives can come out a bit more, right? And I think that this is normal, basically, right, for places like the UK. So I think the first one will be an entire setup, absolutely, and it'll be all nonsense, basically, right? And you can already see that it's being set up right now in exactly the way you sketch, right? Which is that, as it were, the conversation is pushed in the wrong direction. It is more, were we harsh enough, right? Whereas the conversation is not at all about what it should be about, which is, well, what about the mental health damage that we've done to the lonely? What about the destroyed lives of a whole generation of children who couldn't go to school and play and hence have had stunted social development, stunted emotional development? This will be a problem for a whole generation, right? What about probably the hundreds of thousands of people who will die prematurely because of the disruptions to the National Health Service, to the terrible health advice that people have gotten, stay at home, don't exercise, and that sort of thing, right?
Nuts,
and it's absolutely horrific. But the reason to think that that'll come back is because this was and is basically the scientific understanding of the last decades that this was stupid. And so the logic of science will sort of reassert itself. It'll be slow, but there were cost-benefit analysis made, including at the British government. There were hence these accountants who said, well, there may be 200,000 deaths coming just from the health disruptions alone, right? And that was in April of 2020. And there were lots of groups, but they weren't well heard, but they were the insider groups. The Wellbeing Economics, of which I'm one in the UK, they're basically unanimous in having said throughout this is stupid. Look at these losses. Look at the huge mental health damage you're doing, which is also bad for physical health. Look at the long-run problems we're getting with the huge government debt. That's going to be paid back, so that'll be austerity. That'll be a huge loss again, right? And that is standard economic thinking as well. So to a certain extent, normal science leads you irrevocably to saying that this was as stupid as you could be. And so you can thwart normal science for a while. You can have these huge governmental rewards for basically, pretending that 2 and 2 is 550 rather than it's 4. But the fact that 2 and 2 is 4 will reassert itself gradually. And then naturally you'll get back to these inquiries in which it will be about bean counting. It will be about how much did you expect to gain? We were supposed to flatten the curve, and that would mean we wouldn't get overrun hospitals. Well, how bad is an overrun hospitals? This thing happens yearly. So give us a calculation
as
to...
I was trying to make.
Exactly. How much were you actually expecting that this would gain? Oh, you weren't expecting anything. It was just about overrun hospital. You didn't actually do a calculation. You didn't actually know whether hospitals could do much net benefit to these people either. So whether it was even good, because lots of these ventilators, for instance, in hospitals were probably not all that useful. Most people on them early died with them. This whole notion that the hospital had something to offer a lot of these COVID patients was also weird. So to a certain extent, rationality went out of the window entirely in these early weeks, right? It was totally unscientific. It was against scientific advice. It was against health codes. It was against WHO codes. I mean, basically, we had lots and lots of scientific barriers against lockdowns. And so, that will reassert itself to a certain extent, right? And then the inquiries will come more. But indeed, given the political and economic capital that's now on the side of the guilty, if you like, it'll take some doing. But I do think it'll happen. So I'm optimistic. But it won't be in 1 or 2 years' time, unless, the situation becomes so bad that the population wakes up a bit more quicker than it normally does.
Thanks for making it all the way to the end of the video. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and leave a comment for us in the comments below. Let me know what you thought and if you'd like to see more of this from the show. Thank you, and we'll see you again next time.